The 5 men leaning against the saloon bar didn't bother lowering their voices when they made the bet about Grace Harper lasting until spring, and she heard every cruel word as she stood in the general store across the muddy street of Piñon, New Mexico territory, in the bitter cold of January 1884. Grace had arrived 3 days earlier on the afternoon stage, clutching a worn carpetbag, and a letter from her late aunt's solicitor informing her that she'd inherited a small homestead 5 miles outside town. At 22 years old, with her parents dead from fever 2 years past, and her position as a seamstress in St. Louis eliminated when the dress shop burned down, this inheritance represented her only chance at independence. The men in the saloon didn't know her circumstances, but they'd taken one look at her city clothes and soft hands and decided she wouldn't last 3 months in the harsh New Mexico winter. "I give her 6 weeks before she sells that place for pennies and runs back east," one of them said loud enough for half the town to hear. Grace's fingers tightened on the jar of preserves she'd been examining. She had $47 to her name, a homestead she hadn't yet seen, and apparently the distinction of being the subject of the town's entertainment. She paid for her supplies with as much dignity as she could muster, and stepped back into the January wind that cut through her wool coat like it was made of paper. The homestead was worse than she'd imagined. The cabin had a leaking roof, one broken window stuffed with rags, and a door that hung crooked on its hinges. The barn was in slightly better condition, but empty except for some old hay and a family of mice. Her aunt had clearly been struggling before she died, and Grace felt tears prick her eyes as she surveyed her inheritance in the fading afternoon light. She didn't cry. She'd learned years ago that tears accomplished nothing. Instead, she built a fire in the stone hearth, grateful that at least the chimney seemed sound, and made a list by candlelight of everything that needed fixing. The list covered 3 pages. The next morning, she walked back to town with the last of her aunt's preserves to sell and whatever dignity she had left. The general store owner, a weathered man named Mr. Carson, looked at her with something like pity when she asked about selling them. "I can give you $2 for the lot," he said. "Truth is, Miss Harper, that's generous. Most folks make their own." She took the $2. On her way out, she nearly collided with a tall man entering the store. He caught her elbow to steady her, and she looked up into the bluest eyes she'd ever seen. "Sorry, madam," he said, immediately releasing her and stepping back. He was perhaps 26 or 27, with dark hair that needed cutting and several days' worth of stubble on his strong jaw. His clothes marked him as a working cowboy, worn but clean, and he held his hat respectfully in his hands. "My fault," Grace said quickly. "I wasn't watching where I was going." He nodded and moved past her, and she continued to the boarding house where she'd taken a room until she could make the cabin livable. It was only later, when she was trying to calculate how to make her remaining $49 stretch to cover supplies and repairs, that she realized the cowboy had been one of the men she'd seen around town, but not one of the ones in the saloon making bets about her failure. 3 days later, Grace was on her hands and knees trying to patch the cabin floor when she heard a horse approach. She scrambled to her feet, suddenly aware of how alone she was out here, and grabbed the heavy iron poker from beside the fireplace. When she peered through the window, she saw the blue-eyed cowboy from the general store dismounting from a sturdy bay horse. He had a coil of rope over his shoulder and what looked like tools in his saddlebag. Grace opened the door before he could knock, poker still in hand. "Can I help you?" He looked at the poker, then at her face, and had the grace not to smile. "Name's Preston Irwin, madam. I work at the Double R Ranch about 10 miles north. I heard you inherited the Harper place." "That's correct." Grace didn't lower the poker. "What do you want?" "I knew your aunt," Preston said simply. "She was a kind woman, helped my mother when she was sick a few years back, wouldn't take payment. When I heard someone had inherited the place, I thought I'd ride out and see if you needed help with repairs." Grace studied him carefully. His eyes were direct and honest, and there was no mockery in his expression. "Why would you help me? Like I said, your aunt was kind to my family." He gestured to the cabin. "And this place needs more work than one person can handle alone, especially before spring." The mention of spring made Grace's jaw tighten. Before spring. That's what the men had bet. She lifted her chin. "I can't pay you, didn't ask you to." Preston shifted the rope on his shoulder. "I've got today and tomorrow off. Figured I could fix your roof and that window, maybe shore up the door. If you're willing." Pride warred with practicality in Grace's chest. Practicality won. "The roof leaks over the bed when it rains." Preston's expression didn't change, but something warm flickered in his eyes. "Then we'd better start there." He worked through the afternoon, and Grace helped where she could, handing him tools and holding boards steady while he hammered. He didn't talk much, but he wasn't unfriendly. When she brought him water and some of the bread she'd made that morning, he thanked her politely and took a short break before climbing back onto the roof. "You've done this before," Grace observed when he came down to get more nails. "Grew up doing it," Preston said. "My father was a carpenter before he started ranching. He taught me and my brothers." "How many brothers do you have?" "Two. Both married now with families of their own." He glanced at her, then away. "They live up in Colorado. I'm the youngest." Grace wanted to ask why he'd stayed in New Mexico territory, but it seemed too personal a question for someone she'd just met. Instead, she went back to sweeping out the cabin while he finished the roof. By sunset, the roof was patched. The window was fitted with actual glass that Preston had brought from town, and the door hung straight and closed properly. Grace stood in the doorway, looking at the transformed cabin with something dangerously close to hope blooming in her chest. "Thank you," she said, turning to face Preston. "I don't know how to repay you. No repayment needed." He gathered his tools and secured them to his saddle. "I'll be back tomorrow if that's all right. Barn needs work too, and you'll want somewhere secure if you're planning to get chickens or a cow." "I'm planning to get everything I need to make this place work," Grace said firmly. Preston mounted his horse and looked down at her. In the fading light, his expression was unreadable. "I believe you will, Miss Harper. I'll see you in the morning." He rode off into the twilight, and Grace stood watching until he disappeared over the rise. That night, sleeping in a bed that stayed dry despite the rain that came in the early hours, she admitted to herself that Preston Irwin might be the answer to prayers. She'd been too proud to speak aloud. True to his word, Preston returned at dawn with more supplies and a work ethic that put Grace's city-bred efforts to shame. He rebuilt the worst sections of the barn, reinforced the fence around the property, and even helped her plan where to put a kitchen garden when the ground thawed. "You'll want to start with hardy vegetables," he said, sketching a rough layout in the dirt with a stick. "Beans, squash, corn. They grow well here once you get past the frost." "I've never grown anything in my life," Grace admitted. She was sitting on a log near where he crouched, close enough to see the diagram he was drawing. "In St. Louis, I bought everything from the market. You'll learn." Preston looked up at her, and she was struck again by how blue his eyes were, like the New Mexico sky on a clear day. "It's not as hard as you think. Plants want to grow, you just have to give them a fighting chance." "Is that true of everything?" Grace asked quietly. "Give them a fighting chance and they'll grow." Preston understood what she was really asking. "I think you've got more than a fighting chance, Miss Harper. I think you've got determination, which is worth more than experience out here." "The men in town don't agree," Grace said before she could stop herself. "They're betting I'll run back east before spring." Something hard flashed across Preston's face. "I heard about that bet. Don't pay it any mind. Those men don't know the first thing about you." "Neither do you," Grace pointed out. "No," Preston agreed, standing up and brushing dirt from his hands. "But I'm learning. And so far, everything I've learned tells me those men are going to lose their money." Over the next 2 weeks, Preston came by whenever he had time off from the Double R. He brought supplies he claimed were extra from the ranch, though Grace suspected he was buying them himself. He taught her how to split wood properly so she didn't exhaust herself or risk injury, how to bank a fire so it would last through the cold nights, and how to read the weather in the clouds and wind. "Snow's coming," he said one afternoon in late January, studying the sky. "Big storm, probably tonight. You should come back to town, stay at the boarding house until it passes." "I'll be fine here," Grace said stubbornly. She'd finally gotten the cabin comfortable, and she wasn't going to abandon it at the first sign of trouble. Preston's jaw tightened. "Miss Harper, I don't think you understand. Winter storms out here aren't like city snow. You could be snowed in for days, maybe a week. If something happens, no one could get to you." "I have food, firewood, and a sound roof thanks to you," Grace said. "I'll manage." "Grace." It was the first time he'd used her given name, and the sound of it in his low voice sent an unexpected warmth through her. "Please. I'm not saying you're not capable. I'm saying the risk isn't worth it when there's a safe alternative." She wanted to argue, but the genuine concern in his eyes stopped her. "All right," she conceded, "but I'm coming back as soon as the storm passes." "I know you will," Preston said, and the small smile he gave her made her heart do something complicated in her chest. The storm hit that night with a fury that made Grace grateful she'd listened to Preston. Snow fell so thick she couldn't see across the street, and the wind howled like something alive. She sat in her small room at the boarding house, listening to the storm rage and thinking about Preston riding back to the ranch. Had he made it before the worst hit? Was he safe and warm, or was he out in this nightmare trying to round up cattle or rescue stranded animals? The storm lasted 3 days. When it finally cleared, the world was buried under 2 feet of snow that sparkled blindingly in the sunshine. Grace bundled up and made her way to the general store to buy supplies before heading back to her homestead. Mr. Carson looked surprised to see her. "Figured you'd be on the next stage back to civilization after this storm," he said. "This is my home now," Grace said simply. "I'm not going anywhere." She paid for her supplies and turned to find several of the men from the saloon watching her with expressions ranging from skepticism to grudging respect. She ignored them and headed for the door, only to find Preston coming in stamped with snow and leading a pack mule. "I was just coming to get you," he said. "Thought you might need help getting back to your place. Drifts are deep on the northern road." "I was planning to walk." "It's 5 miles through heavy snow." Preston's tone left no room for argument. "You're riding." The trip took over an hour, with Preston's horse breaking trail and the pack mule following behind loaded with supplies. Grace rode beside him on the mule, grateful for its steady gait and the buffalo robe Preston had insisted she wrap around herself. "How was the storm at the ranch?" she asked. "Lost some cattle, but not as many as we feared," Preston said. The boss was pleased. "How was town?" "Warm. Boring." Grace paused. "I was worried about you." Preston glanced at her, something indefinable in his expression. "Were you could have been caught in the storm." "I didn't know if you made it back safely." "I made it back fine," Preston said quietly. "But it's good to know someone was worried." They rode in comfortable silence for a while, the only sounds the crunch of hooves in snow and the occasional call of a winter bird. When they reached the cabin, Preston helped her unload supplies and check that everything had weathered the storm safely. The cabin was cold but intact, and soon Grace had a fire blazing while Preston made sure the barn was still sound. "Everything looks good," he reported when he came back inside, stamping snow from his boots. "You'll want to keep the path to the barn clear. Spring's still 2 months away and we'll likely get more storms." Grace was making coffee on the small stove. "Will you stay for some?" "It's a long ride back to the ranch." Preston hesitated, then nodded. Coffee would be good. They sat at the small table Grace had scrubbed clean her first week, drinking coffee and watching the fire. It felt strangely domestic, and Grace found herself imagining what it would be like if this were her everyday life, sharing coffee and conversation with Preston after a day's work. "Can I ask you something?" Preston said after a while. "Of course." "Why did you come here? Really?" A woman alone from the city, inheriting a run-down homestead. Most people would have sold it sight unseen and stayed where things were comfortable. Grace wrapped her hands around her warm cup, gathering her thoughts. "I didn't have anything comfortable to stay for. My parents died, my job was gone, and I had no prospects. When the letter came about the inheritance, it felt like a sign. A chance to build something that was mine, something no one could take away. And the men betting against you, that doesn't make you want to give up." "It makes me want to prove them wrong," Grace said fiercely. "I'm so tired of people deciding what I can and can't do based on what they think I should be. Delicate, helpless, unable to survive without a man to protect me." She met Preston's eyes. "I'm grateful for your help, truly. But I need you to know I'm not doing this to find a husband or because I'm looking for rescue. I'm doing this because this is my life and my choice." Preston was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I know. That's why I respect you." Something shifted between them then, subtle but profound. When Preston left an hour later, Grace stood in the doorway watching him ride away, and the warmth in her chest had nothing to do with the coffee. February brought more storms, but also stretches of bright, cold days when the sun turned the snow-covered land into something beautiful. Preston continued to visit when he could, and Grace found herself listening for the sound of his horse, looking forward to his quiet competence and the way he explained things without making her feel ignorant. He brought her 3 chickens from the ranch, young hens that would start laying soon. "Boss is culling his flock," he explained. "Said you could have these if you wanted them." Grace was delighted. She'd never kept chickens before, but Preston helped her set up a secure coop in the barn and showed her how to care for them. Within a week, she had her first eggs, and she felt absurdly proud of the 3 brown orbs resting in a bowl on her table. "I did that," she told Preston when he stopped by the next time. "Well, the chickens did, but I kept them safe and fed." Preston's smile was genuine and warm. "You're becoming a proper homesteader, Miss Harper." "Grace," she said impulsively. "You've rebuilt half my property and given me chickens. I think we're past Miss Harper." "Grace," Preston repeated, and again that warmth spread through her at the sound of her name in his voice. "Then you should call me Preston, or just Press. Most people do." "Press." Grace tried it out and liked the way it felt. "Thank you for the chickens, Press." It was such a small thing, the shift from formal address to given names, but it felt significant. Like they were building something between them. As surely as they'd rebuilt the cabin and barn, the men in town noticed. When Grace went in for supplies, she overheard new speculation in the saloon, cruder comments about the city woman catching herself a cowboy. She ignored them with her head held high, but the words stung more than she wanted to admit. Preston noticed her quiet mood when he came by the next day. "What happened?" "Nothing. Just town gossip." Grace scattered feed for the chickens, not meeting his eyes. "About us." It wasn't a question. "About me catching a husband before I fail as a homesteader," Grace said bitterly. As if that's the only reason you'd help me, as if I couldn't possibly manage on my own. Preston was quiet. Then he said carefully, "Is that what you think? That I'm helping you because I want something in return?" "No." Grace turned to face him, horrified. "No, of course not. You've been nothing but kind and respectful. It's just frustrating that everyone assumes a woman can't do anything without it being about finding a man." "For what it's worth, I think you're doing remarkably well," Preston said. "And I'm not helping you to catch anything or get anything. I'm helping because I want to, because I like you and I admire what you're doing." He paused. "But I'll stop coming by if you think it's causing you problems." "Don't you dare," Grace said fiercely. "I don't care what they say in town. You're the only real friend I have here." Friend. The word hung between them, not quite adequate but safe. Preston nodded slowly. "Friends then, and friends help each other." March arrived with the first hints of spring. The snow began to melt, turning the roads to mud and revealing the brown earth beneath. Grace's chickens laid more eggs, and she started selling the extras in town, adding precious coins to her dwindling funds. She was learning to bake bread that didn't taste like saddle leather and to cook beans and salt pork into something edible. Preston taught her to shoot, setting up targets behind the barn and patiently correcting her stance. "You're out here alone," he said. "You need to be able to protect yourself, not just from people but from animals. Wolves, cougars, they come down from the hills when they're hungry." Grace had never held a gun before, and the weight of the revolver in her hand made her nervous. But Preston was patient, standing behind her with his hands guiding hers until she got the feel of it. "Breathe out slowly, then squeeze," he instructed, his breath warm against her ear. Grace's shot went wide. So did the next 3. But the 5th one clipped the target, and by the end of the afternoon she was hitting it more often than not. The gun's kick hurt her wrist, and the noise made her ears ring, but she felt powerful in a way she never had before. "You're a natural," Preston said with approval. "Hardly. But I'm learning." Grace handed him back the gun, suddenly very aware of how close he was standing. She could see the fine lines at the corners of his eyes from squinting into the sun, the exact shade of stubble on his jaw. When had she started noticing such things about him? Preston seemed to feel it too, the shift in the air between them. He stepped back carefully like he was afraid of startling her. "I should head back to the ranch. Got early duty tomorrow." "Of course." Grace felt flustered, which annoyed her. "Thank you for the lesson." After he left, she sat on the porch steps and tried to sort through her feelings. She'd told herself she came here for independence, not romance. But somewhere between January and March, between roof repairs and chicken coops and shooting lessons, Preston Irwin had become essential to her happiness in a way that had nothing to do with friendship. The realization terrified her. Caring about someone meant they could hurt you, could leave you, could die like her parents had. It was safer to rely only on herself. But her heart apparently had other ideas, beating faster whenever she heard Preston's horse approaching, warming whenever he smiled at her. She was in trouble, and spring hadn't even officially arrived yet. The men in town lost their bet on the first day of spring. Grace walked into the general store with a basket of eggs to sell and her head held high, and the silence that fell was sweeter than any victory speech. Mr. Carson bought her eggs without comment, but there was new respect in his eyes. One of the men from the saloon actually approached her on the street. His name was Bill something, and he'd been particularly vocal about her imminent failure. "I owe you an apology, Miss Harper," he said, hat in his hands. "We had no call to talk about you the way we did. You've proved us wrong." Grace studied him coldly. "You bet that I'd fail before you ever gave me a chance to try. That says more about you than it ever did about me." Bill flushed but nodded. "Yes, madam, that's fair. For what it's worth, there's a few of us who'd be happy to help if you need anything. I'll keep that in mind." Grace's tone made it clear she wouldn't be calling on him anytime soon. She walked past him to where Preston was waiting by his horse, having ridden in to meet her. "Saw that," Preston said, a hint of pride in his voice. "How do you feel?" "Victorious," Grace admitted. "And petty, which isn't admirable, but there it is. You're allowed to feel victorious. You earned it." Preston helped her load her supplies onto his horse. "And you're allowed to feel petty. Those men weren't kind." They rode back to the homestead together, a routine that had become comfortingly familiar. The land was transforming, with spring brown earth showing through the last patches of snow, and Grace could see where she'd plant her garden. The chickens were thriving, and she'd saved enough money to think about buying a cow. Her cabin was snug and sound. She'd done it. She'd made it through the winter. "What are you thinking?" Preston asked as they rode. "That I did it. I'm still here." "You doubted you would be." "Every single day," Grace admitted. "I had no idea what I was doing. I still don't most of the time." "None of us do," Preston said quietly. "We're all just trying our best and hoping it's enough." When they reached the cabin, Preston helped her unload supplies but seemed hesitant to leave. He checked things that didn't need checking and lingered by his horse. "Press," Grace finally said. "Is something wrong?" "I need to tell you something." Preston turned to face her, his expression serious. "The boss is moving part of the herd north next month. Wants me to go with the drive, help set up a new range in Colorado near where my brothers settled." Grace's heart sank. "For how long?" 2 months, maybe 3. We'd leave in mid-April, be back by July, 2 or 3 months without seeing him. The thought created a hollow ache in Grace's chest. "I see." "I can tell him no," Preston said quickly. "I can say I'm needed here. He'll understand." "You absolutely will not," Grace said firmly, even though part of her wanted to beg him to stay. "This is your job, your livelihood. I won't be the reason you miss an opportunity." "Grace." Preston stepped closer, his blue eyes intense. "You wouldn't be a reason, you'd be a choice." "There's a difference." They stood looking at each other, and Grace felt the weight of everything unspoken hanging between them. How did she tell him that he'd become the best part of her days? That she'd come here looking for independence but found something richer, more complicated? That the thought of him leaving created an ache she'd never expected? "You should go," she made herself say. "I'll be fine. Spring is here, the hard part is over." "Is it?" Preston's voice was low. "Because it feels like the hard part is just starting." Grace's breath caught. "Press, I'm in love with you," Preston said, the words rough and honest. "I didn't mean to be. I came here to help because of your aunt, stayed because you needed assistance. But somewhere along the way, it stopped being about obligation and started being about you. The way you face down everything that frightens you. The way you keep trying even when you don't know what you're doing. The way you stand up to those fools in town, and the way you look at sunrise when you think I'm not watching." He took a breath. "I know this isn't what you came here for. I know you wanted independence, not a cowboy who can't offer you much beyond hard work and a simple life. But I needed to tell you before I left. You deserve to know." Grace felt tears prick her eyes. "Press, I'm not crying because I'm sad," she said when he started to reach for her. "I'm crying because for months I've been telling myself I came here to be alone, to be independent. And you've helped me be those things. But you've also made me realize that independence doesn't mean being alone. It means choosing who you share your life with instead of having someone chosen for you or being forced into it by circumstances." "Grace, I love you too," she interrupted. "I fought it because I was afraid. Afraid of needing someone, afraid of losing someone else I care about. But I'm more afraid of letting fear keep me from something real." Preston closed the distance between them and cupped her face in his work-roughened hands. Are you sure? Because once I kiss you, I'm not going to want to stop. Not just the kissing, but all of it. Courting you properly, marrying you if you'll have me, building a life together. I'm sure, Grace whispered. I'm terrified and sure at the same time. Preston kissed her then, gentle at first, then deeper when she wrapped her arms around his neck and kissed him back. He tasted like coffee and possibility, and Grace felt something lock into place in her chest, like a door closing on her old life and opening to something new. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, Preston rested his forehead against hers. I don't have to go on the drive. Yes, you do, Grace said firmly. Because you're going to come back and we're going to court properly like you said, and I'm not going to be accused of trapping you or making you give up opportunities. Stubborn woman. You knew that when you fell for me. Preston laughed and the sound filled Grace with joy. Fair point. All right, I'll go on the drive, but I'm coming back to you, Grace Harper. And when I do, we're doing this right, courting, the whole town watching, everything proper. I look forward to it, Grace said. Then, daringly, she pulled him down for another kiss. They spent the rest of the afternoon together, and everything felt different now that feelings were spoken aloud. Preston held her hand while they planned the garden. He kissed her again by the barn. They sat on the porch steps as the sun set, Grace leaning against his shoulder, both of them quiet and content. 2 months, Preston said finally. 2 months, Grace agreed. I'll be here when you get back. I know you will. You don't run away from things. Not anymore. Grace tilted her face up to look at him. I found something worth staying for. The weeks before Preston left were bittersweet. He spent every free moment at the homestead, helping Grace plant her garden and fence a pasture for the cow she planned to buy. They talked about everything and nothing, learning each other's stories. Preston told her about growing up in a family of carpenters who became ranchers, about losing his father young and helping his mother keep the family together. Grace told him about her parents' deaths, about the loneliness of city life as an orphan, about the desperate hope she'd felt reading her aunt's letter. She gave you a gift, Preston said. Not just the land, but the chance for a new life. The best gift, Grace agreed. Though she probably didn't expect it to come with you. Lucky for both of us. They didn't tell anyone in town about their understanding, wanting to keep it private until after the cattle drive. But Mrs. Anderson at the boarding house gave Grace a knowing look when she came in for supplies, and Mr. Carson's gruff demeanor softened noticeably when he saw Preston's horse outside the homestead during his delivery runs. The night before Preston left, they stood under the vast New Mexico sky, stars scattered overhead like diamonds on velvet. Grace had never seen stars like this in St. Louis, never felt the kind of peace that came from knowing where she belonged. I'll write when I can, Preston promised. We'll be passing through towns with post offices. I'll write back, Grace said. Tell you about the garden, the chickens, how the cow I'm buying produces milk. You're buying a cow tomorrow from the Simpson Ranch. I've been saving, Grace smiled. I'm becoming quite the homesteader. You were always quite the homesteader, Preston said. You just needed to believe it. He kissed her goodbye in the darkness, a long, sweet kiss that promised return and future, and everything Grace had stopped letting herself dream about. When he finally mounted his horse, she stood watching until he disappeared into the night, then touched her fingers to her lips and made herself go inside. The next 2 months were the longest of Grace's life. She threw herself into work, planting the garden with seeds Preston had helped her choose, caring for the cow she bought, expanding the chicken coop when one of her hens went broody and hatched chicks. She kept the cabin spotless and made improvements, sewing curtains and building shelves. She practiced shooting until she could hit targets consistently. She proved to herself and anyone watching that she could manage alone, but alone felt different now. Before Preston, alone had meant independent, self-sufficient, safe. After Preston, alone just meant lonely. She missed his quiet company, his rare smiles, the way he explained things without condescension. She missed his hands in hers, his kisses, the way he looked at her like she was something precious. His letters arrived sporadically, carried by the erratic mail system. They were short but heartfelt, describing the cattle drive's progress and the beauty of the land they crossed. He wrote about his brother's joy at seeing him and their curiosity about the woman he mentioned. He wrote that he counted the days until he could return. Grace wrote back faithfully, her letters longer and more detailed. She told him about the garden's first sprouts, about the calf born to her cow, about facing down a coyote that came after the chickens. She wrote about town gossip and spring storms and how the land looked as it turned green. She told him she counted the days too. June arrived with heat and the garden in full glory. Grace harvested her first vegetables with pride and sold the surplus in town. The men who'd bet against her now tipped their hats respectfully, and new women in town, other homesteaders and ranchers' wives, began including her in their circles. She was no longer the city woman expected to fail. She was Grace Harper, who'd survived winter alone and made her land productive. But she still missed Preston with an ache that time didn't diminish. The afternoon he returned, Grace was in the garden weeding when she heard a horse approach. She looked up, shading her eyes against the sun, and saw a rider coming fast across the prairie. Her heart knew before her eyes confirmed it, and she was running before she made a conscious decision, dirt on her hands and her apron flying. Preston dismounted before his horse fully stopped and caught her as she launched herself at him. He spun her around, laughing, then kissed her hard and deep, and Grace felt everything broken inside her knit back together. "You're back," she said unnecessarily when they broke apart, both grinning like fools. "I'm back," Preston agreed, "and I'm not leaving again. Told the boss I'm staying local from now on. Press, you can't sacrifice your job for me. Not sacrificing, choosing." Preston cupped her face, his thumb stroking her cheek. "I got offered a foreman position at a ranch closer to town. Better pay, more stability. I accepted." "If that's all right with you, if it's all right," Grace laughed, feeling giddy. "I've been miserable without you." "Good," Preston said, then kissed her again because he could. "Because I've been miserable without you too, and I'm never doing it again." They walked back to the cabin hand in hand, and Preston admired everything Grace had accomplished in his absence. The thriving garden, the chickens and their chicks, the cow and calf grazing in the pasture. "You did all this yourself," he said with pride. "I did," Grace agreed. "But Press, it's better with you here." That night, sitting on the porch watching the sunset, Preston said, "We should talk about the future, all right? I want to marry you, Grace. I wanted to ask before I left, but I wanted to do it right. Court you properly, make sure you were certain." "I'm certain," Grace said immediately. "I was certain before you left." "Then marry me." Preston took her hand. "I don't have a ring yet, was planning to buy one in town, but I can't wait another day to ask. Marry me, build this life with me. Your land and my new job, together we can make something good." "Yes," Grace said, tears slipping down her cheeks. "Yes, of course, yes." Preston kissed her tears away, then her lips, and Grace felt the last wall around her heart crumble. She'd come to New Mexico territory looking for independence, and found partnership instead. Not the kind forced on her by society's expectations, but the kind chosen freely by two people who'd learned to trust each other. They announced their engagement the next Sunday at church, and if anyone was surprised, they hid it well. Mrs. Anderson clapped her hands in delight, and several of the ranch wives who'd befriended Grace offered to help with the wedding. Even the men who'd bet against her seemed pleased, with Bill offering awkward congratulations that Grace accepted graciously. They were married 6 weeks later in the small church in Piñon, with half the town attending. Grace wore a simple cream-colored dress she'd sewn herself, and Preston wore his best clothes and looked so handsome Grace's breath caught when she saw him waiting at the altar. They spoke their vows in front of God and witnesses, promising to love and cherish through all the challenges frontier life would bring. The reception was held at the homestead, with tables set up outside and food brought by various townspeople. Someone had a fiddle, and there was dancing as the sun set over the prairie. Grace danced with her new husband under the stars, and when Preston pulled her close, she rested her head against his chest and listened to his heartbeat and thought she'd never been happier. No regrets. Preston murmured against her hair. "Not a single one," Grace said honestly. Only that I didn't work up the courage to court you sooner. You came when I needed you," Grace said. "That's all that matters." Their first year of marriage was full of joy and work in equal measure. Preston moved into the cabin he'd helped repair, and together they made it a real home. They expanded the homestead, adding more chickens, another cow, and eventually a pair of pigs. Preston's job as foreman paid well enough that they could afford improvements and save for the future. Grace's garden flourished, and she learned to preserve vegetables for winter, her cellar filling with jars of beans and tomatoes and pickles. She became known in town for her eggs and butter, building a small business that gave her pride and independence even within marriage. Preston never questioned her right to her own money or tried to control how she spent it. They were partners in the truest sense. The second winter was easier than the first, with Preston beside her and the cabin secure. They spent long evenings by the fire, Preston carving wood while Grace sewed, talking about everything and nothing. Sometimes they just sat in comfortable silence, and Grace marveled at how far she'd come from the desperate woman who'd arrived on the afternoon stage. Spring brought new life. The cows calved, the chickens hatched more chicks, and Grace discovered she was pregnant. She told Preston one morning in May while they were working in the garden together. "I'm going to have a baby," she said, kneeling in the dirt with her hands full of seedlings. Preston dropped the hoe he was holding. "A baby, our baby." Grace smiled at his shocked expression. "Probably late fall, the way I calculate it." Preston whooped and picked her up, spinning her around despite her protests about the seedlings. "We're having a baby, Grace, we're having a baby." "I gathered you're pleased," Grace said, laughing. "Pleased, I'm thrilled, terrified but thrilled." Preston set her down carefully, suddenly treating her like glass. "Should you be working? Is it safe? What do you need?" "I need you to stop panicking," Grace said firmly. "Women have babies while working farms all the time. I'll be fine." Preston was both attentive and anxious throughout the pregnancy, fussing over Grace even as she insisted she felt wonderful. The ranch wives rallied around her, sharing advice and hand-me-down baby clothes and stories meant to prepare her. Grace was grateful for their friendship, these women who'd welcomed her into their community. Their son was born in November during the first snowstorm of winter. It was a long labor, and Grace thought at one point she might die from the pain, but Preston stayed beside her the entire time, holding her hand and wiping her face with cool cloths. When the baby finally emerged, crying lustily, Grace wept with relief and joy. "A boy," the midwife announced, handing the cleaned and swaddled infant to Grace. "Healthy and strong." Grace looked down at her son's red face and searching eyes and fell completely in love. Preston touched the baby's tiny hand with one finger, his expression awed. "What should we name him?" he asked. They discussed names, but now Grace knew exactly right. "Samuel, after your father." Preston's eyes filled with tears. Samuel Irwin." He kissed Grace's forehead. "Thank you for him, for everything." Samuel was a content baby who nursed well and slept in reasonable stretches. Grace recovered quickly and was soon back to her routine, with the baby in a sling while she did chores. Preston was a devoted father, walking the floor with Sam when he fussed and changing nappies without complaint. "You're good at this," Grace told him one night, watching him rock their son. "I had good examples," Preston said. "My brothers both have children. I learned from watching them." "Will we visit them, your brothers and mother?" When Sam's older and travel is easier, they're excited to meet him. "My letters tell them all about you both." Life settled into a new rhythm, busier now with a baby but no less happy. Samuel grew quickly, reaching milestones that filled Grace and Preston with pride. By spring, he was crawling, and by the following fall, he was walking and getting into everything. The homestead continued to prosper. Preston received a raise when the ranch owner recognized his skill, and they were able to hire occasional help for the heaviest work. Grace's egg and butter business expanded, and she even began selling vegetables at the town market. They weren't wealthy, but they were comfortable and happy. When Samuel was 2, Grace found herself pregnant again. This time the pregnancy was easier, maybe because she knew what to expect. Their daughter was born in spring, an April baby with dark hair and blue eyes like her father. "Margaret," Grace said, looking at the infant in her arms. "After your mother, Preston was silent for a moment, overcome. His mother had passed during the previous winter, a loss that had hit him hard. "Maggie," he said finally. "She'd be honored." Margaret was a different baby than Samuel had been, more demanding and less easily settled. But Grace loved her fierce spirit, seeing something of herself in her daughter's determination. Samuel was fascinated by his baby sister, wanting to help with everything even when his help created more work. The years passed in a blur of love and labor. Grace watched her children grow, Samuel serious and thoughtful like his father, Margaret bold and adventurous. They helped with chores as soon as they were able, feeding chickens and gathering eggs and learning the rhythms of ranch life. Preston's career continued to advance, and eventually he was offered a partnership in a smaller ranch closer to their homestead. He discussed it with Grace over several nights, weighing the risks and rewards. "It would mean longer hours, more responsibility," he said. "But also more security for our future, for Sam and Maggie." "What do you want to do?" Grace asked. "I want your opinion. This affects all of us," Grace considered. "I think you should take it. You're a natural leader, and we've proven we can handle challenges." So Preston became a ranch partner, and life grew busier still. But they made it work through partnership and love, sharing responsibilities and supporting each other. Some nights Grace fell into bed exhausted, but it was the good kind of tired that came from meaningful work. When Samuel was 8 and Margaret 6, Grace discovered she was pregnant again, a surprise that left her both delighted and daunted. She was 34 now, and pregnancy felt harder than it had in her 20s. But their third child, a son they named Thomas, arrived safely in winter, healthy and calm like his older brother. "Our family is complete," Grace said, holding Thomas while Preston sat beside her on the bed, their older children crowding close to meet their new brother. "Perfect," Preston agreed, his arm around her shoulders. "Absolutely perfect." The children thrived. Samuel showed an aptitude for working with animals and spent hours with Preston learning ranching. Margaret was drawn to the business side, helping Grace at the market and showing a head for numbers. Thomas was still too young to show clear interests, but he was a happy baby who seemed content wherever he was placed. Grace's homestead, the cabin that had seemed so broken and hopeless that first winter, was now a thriving farm. They'd added rooms to accommodate their growing family, built a proper barn, expanded the pastures. The garden that had started as a few test rows now produced enough to feed them year-round with surplus to sell. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Preston took Grace back to the spot where they'd first kissed behind the original barn, long since rebuilt. Their children were with Mrs. Anderson in town, giving them a rare evening alone. "You ever regret it?" Preston asked, holding both her hands. "Staying here marrying me this life?" Grace looked at the land they'd built together, at the home glowing warm in the twilight, at the man who'd helped her become stronger than she'd ever imagined. "Not for a single second. Do you?" "Never," Preston said. "You're the best thing that ever happened to me, Grace Irwin." "We're the best thing that happened to each other," Grace corrected. She stood on her toes to kiss him, feeling the same spark she'd felt that first time. "You made sure I'd never want to leave. You made a place worth staying for," Preston countered. They stood together watching the sunset paint the New Mexico sky in shades of gold and crimson. Two people who'd found in each other exactly what they needed. Grace thought about that desperate, determined woman who'd arrived in Piñon 12 years ago, clutching a carpetbag and a dream. She'd come looking for independence and found partnership. She'd come running from loneliness and found love. She'd come to prove she could survive alone and discovered that surviving was nothing compared to thriving together. The men in town had bet she'd run away before spring came. They hadn't counted on a cowboy with blue eyes and a kind heart who'd seen her strength before she fully recognized it herself. They hadn't imagined that the city woman in impractical clothes would become a cornerstone of the community, or that her homestead would become one of the most prosperous small farms in the territory. But most of all, they hadn't understood that Grace Harper, now Grace Irwin, didn't run from challenges. She faced them head-on, learned from her mistakes, and built something beautiful from broken pieces. Years continued to pass with the steady rhythm of seasons. Samuel grew into a young man who took after his father in temperament and skill, eventually buying land adjacent to theirs to start his own ranch. Margaret shocked everyone by expressing interest in studying business in Santa Fe, and Grace and Preston supported her ambition, even when neighbors questioned the wisdom of educating a daughter so extensively. Thomas, quiet and thoughtful, showed talent for carpentry and began apprenticing with a builder in town, carrying on his grandfather's craft. Grace and Preston grew older together, their hair graying and lines deepening around their eyes, but their love remained constant. They still worked side by side, though they hired more help now and took time to travel, visiting Preston's brothers in Colorado and taking their children to see more of the territory they called home. On winter evenings, they sat by the fire in the cabin Preston had repaired so long ago, and sometimes Grace thought about that first desperate winter. How cold she'd been, how uncertain. How the men in the saloon had bet against her, never imagining she'd still be here decades later, surrounded by family and prosperity earned through determination and partnership. "What are you thinking about?" Preston asked one such evening, catching her reflective expression. "The bet," Grace said. "Those men who wagered I'd run away before spring," Preston chuckled. "Best bet they ever lost. I should thank them. Their doubt just made you more determined." "That's true," Grace admitted. "But you know what really made me stay? What made this home instead of just a place?" "What?" "You," Grace said simply. "You saw me when I was struggling and didn't mock me for it. You helped without expecting anything in return. You respected my independence even while offering partnership. You made me feel capable and cherished at the same time." Preston pulled her close, and she rested her head on his shoulder like she'd done countless times before. "You did the same for me," he said quietly. I was just going through motions before you came, working, existing, but not really living. You gave me purpose beyond just getting through each day." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the fire and listening to the wind outside, the same wind that had howled so frighteningly that first winter. But now the cabin was warm and solid, filled with evidence of the life they'd built. Photographs on the mantel showed their children at various ages. Hand-sewn quilts draped over furniture. Books Preston had taught himself to read better lined a shelf. Grace's preserves filled the cellar, enough to last the winter and share with neighbors. The homestead that had been a desperate refuge had become a legacy. Samuel would inherit the original property, already working it alongside his own land. Margaret, despite her education and business interests, had declared she'd always keep a home here, unwilling to fully leave the place that had shaped her. Thomas spoke of building houses throughout the territory, but returning each winter to the family ranch. Grace and Preston's love story became the kind told to grandchildren. The tale of the city woman who refused to fail and the cowboy who recognized her strength. Their marriage was held up as an example of partnership built on respect and shared work, of love that deepened through challenges faced together. When spring came again, as it always did, Grace walked through her garden planning the year's planting. She was 60 now, her hands marked by decades of work, her back not as straight as it once was. But she was healthy and happy, surrounded by family and the fruits of her labor. Preston found her among the early sprouts, standing in the sunshine with her face turned to the sky. He wrapped his arms around her from behind and she leaned back against him, fitting perfectly as she always had. "Spring came again," Grace observed. "It always does," Preston said. "And you're still here." "Still here," Grace agreed. "Still home, always home." They stood together in the garden, two people who'd chosen each other and chosen this life, proving that the best bets were the ones made on love and determination. The men who'd wagered against Grace lasting until spring had lost their money and learned a valuable lesson about underestimating quiet strength. But Grace had won something far more valuable than proving doubters wrong. She'd won a life of meaning, a partnership of equals, and a love that had weathered every storm the New Mexico territory could throw at them. She'd learned that independence wasn't about being alone, but about having the freedom to choose your path and your companions. As Grace and Preston walked back to the cabin hand in hand, the homestead spread around them like a testament to what two determined people could build together. The chickens scratched in their expanded yard, the cattle grazed in green pastures, the garden promised abundance, and the house stood solid and welcoming. This was what the men in the saloon hadn't understood that cold January day when they made their cruel bet. They'd seen a city woman out of her element and assumed she'd break. They hadn't seen her spine of steel or the determination in her eyes. And they certainly hadn't anticipated a cowboy named Preston Irwin who would recognize something precious and worth protecting. Together, Grace and Preston had built more than a prosperous homestead. They'd built a family, a legacy, and a love story that proved the best partnerships were those freely chosen, built on respect, trust, and shared dreams. They'd proven that sometimes the greatest adventure wasn't running away but standing firm, putting down roots, and growing something beautiful from difficult ground. The homestead would stand for generations, passed down through children who knew the story of how it all began. They would tell their own children about Grace Harper, who came west with nothing but courage and determination, and Preston Irwin, who saw her value when others saw only certain failure. They would speak of that first brutal winter, of spring's eventual arrival, of a love that bloomed amid hard work and mutual respect. And on quiet evenings when the wind blew across the prairie, when the stars scattered overhead in their ancient patterns, the land itself seemed to remember that first desperate winter, and the two people who'd transformed struggle into triumph, loneliness into love, and a broken-down homestead into a forever home. Grace had come to New Mexico territory looking for a fresh start, a chance to prove herself, a place to belong. She'd found all that and more. She'd found partnership, purpose, and a love that made every challenge worthwhile. The men had bet she'd run away before spring came. Instead, she dug in her heels, opened her heart, and created a life so rich and full that leaving had become unthinkable. Preston had made sure she never wanted to leave, but in truth, they'd made that together. Every roof he'd repaired, every lesson he'd taught, every moment of respect and support had woven them together. And every challenge Grace had faced, every skill she'd mastered, every time she'd stood tall against doubt had strengthened the bond between them. Their story wasn't one of rescue but of partnership, not of dependence but of choice, not of weakness overcome but of strength recognized and nurtured. It was a love story as vast and enduring as the New Mexico landscape, as steady as the changing seasons, as real and solid as the earth beneath their feet. And when, decades later, Grace and Preston were laid to rest in the small cemetery outside Piñon, their children and grandchildren gathered around graves marked with simple stones, the whole town turned out to honor them. Not just because they'd been respected members of the community, though they had been, but because their love story had become legend, a reminder that the best things in life were worth fighting for, that true partnership elevated both people, and that sometimes the greatest victory was simply staying, building, and loving through every season that came. The homestead continued on, worked now by Samuel's children, the cabin expanded but still containing that original room that Preston had repaired so many years ago. The garden still flourished in the same spot Grace had planted it. The barn, rebuilt twice now, stood on the foundation Preston had laid. And in the evening, when the sun set over the prairie in shades of gold and crimson, you could almost see two figures standing hand in hand, watching the land they'd loved and tended, together until the very end and beyond. This was their legacy, not just land and buildings, but proof that determination could overcome any obstacle, that love built on respect could weather any storm, and that sometimes the people everyone bet against became the ones who won everything that truly mattered. Grace Harper Irwin and Preston Irwin had shown an entire town what was possible when strength met kindness, when stubbornness met support, when two hearts chose each other freely, and built something lasting. The bet had been that she'd run away before spring came. The truth was that she'd found something worth staying for, and together with a blue-eyed cowboy who'd seen her value from the start, she'd built not just a homestead but a home, not just a life but a love story that would be told for generations, inspiring others to stand firm, choose bravely, and believe that the best bets were always the ones made on love.